Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Domas, and I'm the Director of the Michigan Chemistry Council. Welcome to today's webinar on what facility operators should know about drone technologies and regulations. Today's webinar is being presented and sponsored by our tremendous partners at Barnes & Thornburg, a full-service business law firm with many offices nationwide, including Michigan offices in Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, and Southfield. I'm particularly excited to be able to offer this webinar and program today, as I think it's really unique and valuable content that won't be easily found anywhere else. This issue of drones has come onto the scene significantly in recent years, and according to the FAA, there are more than 1.5 million drones currently registered. That number is increasing all the while. And while new technologies will offer great promise for doing many things better, safer, and cheaper, there's also new challenges for keeping facilities safe and secure. And many operators of facilities of all types may either just assume there's no way that third-party drones would be allowed to fly over their critical infrastructure, or they're unaware of the specific laws and regulations that are in the books that can provide some protections. And they may be equally surprised to learn that their regulators may soon come looking to use drones around their facilities. And since this area is such an ever-changing landscape of both federal and state rules, today's webinar will provide a valuable overview of the issue area, as well as some specific resources for participants. And I'm very excited today to have an expert presenter, is Mary Kamazi, who is of counsel in Barnes & Thornburg's aviation and unmanned aerial vehicles and corporate practices. She has extensive experience in corporate transactions and aviation matters, having spent nearly 6 years as in-house counsel with the Helicopter Services Company in Michigan. She's currently chair of the State Bar of Michigan's Aviation Law Section Council. And Mary will be first sharing some very informative content, but we do plan to have and would like some very interactive Q&A following the presentation. And on the Zoom program, you can use either the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen at any time to submit those during the presentation or when we get to the end for Q&A. If you have any technical issues, feel free to also use the chat function or email events@michiganchemistry.com for questions and assistance. And with that, I think we're gonna turn it over to Mary with one for presentation today, and we'll also be doing some polling throughout the presentation to have some interactive participation as well. So thanks again, and take it away, Mary.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks for that introduction. Welcome everyone today. One more note before we get started is that this presentation is for informational purposes only. It is not legal advice. And if you have specific questions that apply to you, you should reach out to your legal provider, or of course, feel free to call us after the presentation. But again, this is just general informative information only. Here's my contact information. As John mentioned, I am primarily based in the Ann Arbor office, but spend time in our other Michigan offices as well. Barnes & Thornburg, as John mentioned, is a nationwide firm, so we deal with aviation issues across the country, well experienced in that area. So today we're going to talk about a few different emerging topics. It seems like drones are ever emerging as the technology just really is exponentially coming along, and the laws, of course, are lagging behind them to keep up. So everything is a shifting landscape, and sometimes the law and the regulatory structure, unfortunately, doesn't match the technology that we're seeing out there and available right now. So we'll talk a little bit about emerging drone applications, how drones are being used today, and some of the things that we've seen, interestingly enough, coming out of COVID, and seeing some new applications that hadn't been used before. We'll talk a little bit about the FAA regulations for operators, including registration issues. We'll dive in a little bit to the Michigan-specific statutes applicable to drones. And then we'll get into the impact of drones on facility security and what it means for your facilities, as well as government use of drones and what that means for facility owners. So I think we have our first polling question, if we can put that up. So we just want to understand a little bit about how people are using their drones. So if you can take a couple of minutes or a few seconds here and answer that question, that would be great while we start talking about what we're seeing going on today. So some of the new things I mentioned with COVID-19, drone operators have found even more uses than what we were seeing for drones, including vaccine delivery. So really getting in front of that, that person-to-person contact issue that we're dealing with right now, and able to utilize drones in that arena. And speaking of arenas, where drones have been used in application of chemicals for agricultural purposes for a while, they've adapted and now have come up with technology to use drones for disinfecting arenas and stadiums, as you can see in the image here, using that same sort of technology in these large facilities to help disinfect, again, eliminating that personal contact issue and putting this technology to work. Companies are using drones to take inventory. Sometimes inventory is conducted in close quarters, so using drones in that application has been helpful given the spread of COVID-19 through contact. Libraries in rural areas have employed drones to deliver books so that kind of activity can continue as well. You're going to get a copy of these presentation materials, and this article about Texas stadiums using drones in this way is linked here. So that's the blue underlined portion there. So let's see the answer to this first polling question. Great, so we're about 50-50 operating for hobby drones. Let's take a look at polling question number 2. And we'll keep going while you guys have a chance to answer this question. So of course, a lot of the buzz prior to COVID-19 was package delivery and how FedEx, UPS, Amazon, and other retailers are going to employ drone technology to deliver packages. A lot of retailers and shipping companies are looking at the most expensive part of the supply chain, which is the last mile, and using this, this technology to fulfill that last mile of delivery. So you have retailers who may have either their own internal operations or partnering with other shipping companies to fulfill this delivery mechanism. So Amazon, of course, is working on its own through Amazon Prime. Walmart, Walgreens, CVS have all developed partnerships with either Wing, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet. Alphabet is Google's parent company, or maybe FedEx or UPS. These traditional shipping companies, FedEx, UPS, Wing, are all operating under Part 135. So they're conducting commercial operations under an actual FAA certificate, which is different than some of the allowed operations under Part 107, which we're going to talk about, which is the uncertificated operation. Let's take a look at polling question number 2, the results there. Great, so it looks like most of you do not have drone operations at your facilities or in your business, but about 40% do. So we'll talk about both of those as we move through. So a little bit more about the types of drone operations that we're traditionally seeing used. Of course, things like pipeline inspection. Both pipeline owners and governments are using drones in this activity. As you can see here, this drone is marked with a sheriff's emblem. So This could be either security being overseen by law enforcement, or it could be inspection activity, which we'll dive into a little bit later. Other uses that are still emerging are disaster aid and response. So this could include the delivery of materials with drones that are carrying external loads. Also, it's becoming much more widely used by the U.S. Forest Service and other fire agencies to conduct fire mapping. What they do in this situation is the drones can get closer than most other aerial surveillance, where maybe a piloted aircraft is moving in. So these drones can actually get closer, and they're identifying the hot spots of the fire so that water and fire retardant can be more specifically targeted to those areas and really control that. We're seeing a lot of issues. We'll talk a little bit later about drone operations with regard to other operations, but drone operations from hobbyists or maybe media, things like that, are actually interfering with fire operations. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Of course, drones are being used in the agricultural inspection and spraying field. Also crop monitoring, looking for disease in the crops, and all those sorts of things. This is particularly helpful when things are inaccessible, either because of weather conditions or other kinds of things like that that may preclude inspection. It also allows for larger monitoring because the technology is so much quicker than the physical going out and trying to get around the physical barriers to view the things that are trying to be tracked. Railroads are increasing railroad inspection using drone activity. As you can see here, in flooding situations and viewing safety of tracks, it would be rather difficult to do this from a physical standpoint, whereas a drone can go over flooded areas and things like that that may otherwise be unreachable. A few other applications, of course, we have the military applications that most people are familiar with. I think a lot of times when people think about drones, this is the first thing that comes to mind. A type of drone is also being implemented now to vacuum ocean waste off of the surface of the ocean. Conservation departments are using drones to monitor herds and herd populations, animal disease, and track and try to control that. Weather monitoring is becoming a bigger issue there, especially as drones become a little bit more robust and reliable. Merchant ship inspection, again, where it would take a tremendous amount of time to patrol physically, where a drone can do that very quickly. Also detecting emissions infractions and other things like that, and mining activity. So talking about FAA regulations, I mentioned that they're generally for commercial applications and other drone usage. It traditionally falls in three places. It's either hobby, Part 107, or commercial operations under Part 135. So under Part 107, you have to register your drone. You're either going to register under not under 107, but you're either going to register under 107 or you're going to register under the exception for recreational flyers. For Part 107, all drones have to be registered regardless of weight. So if you intend to operate under this section of the FARs, the FAA regulations, you have to register your drone regardless of weight. For recreational flyers, if your drone weighs more than 0.55 pounds, so just over a half a pound, then you also have to register your drone. If you intend to switch between Part 107 and recreational flying, your registration cannot be transferred. So you're going to have to register under both parts. A little bit more about registration. FAA registration certificate has to be in your possession when you fly your drone. If someone else is operating your drone, they need to have that registration certificate in their possession as well. It can be either a paper or a digital copy. If asked for it by any law enforcement officer, you have to show that certificate. If you don't have it, there are criminal or civil penalties for that. All drones are supposed to be marked with that registration number before flight as well. Under Part 107, drones must weigh less than 55 pounds. You will have to operate drones within the visual line of sight only. So there has to be a pilot or a visual observer who can see that drone at all times. You cannot conduct operations over people, under a structure, or inside a covered stationary vehicle. Drones can only be operated during daylight or civil twilight. If you're operating at civil twilight, you have to have anti-collision lighting. You always must yield the right-of-way to other aircraft. Maximum ground speed of 100 miles an hour is all that's allowed under this section of the code. The maximum altitude is 400 feet above ground level. We're going to talk a lot about this 400-foot mark, because this is what the FAA starts controlling airspace over 400 feet. So that's why this mark becomes very important. So under 400 feet is generally considered uncontrolled airspace. So all drone operations under Part 107 have to stay under that mark. You also have to have minimum weather visibility of 3 miles from the control station. I apologize, there's some technical issues here. The slides are not advancing very well, so I apologize for any delays here. So just a little bit more about airspace. This is a graphic that the FAA has published that talks about airspace classification. Class G is general airspace, and this is a generally uncontrolled airspace, and is where Part 107 operations are allowed without a waiver or without air traffic control permission. That permission is going to be required in all of these other types of airspaces. So it's really important to understand where you're operating your drone, what is around you, and what are the requirements. I'm not going to go into this in detail because they're very specific and technical, but you should really understand where you're flying, what are the restrictions around you, and what are the rules that apply to your particular type of operation, particularly with regard to airspace. The other thing that I'm going to say about airspace is most of these Class B, C, and D are dealing with airports. Class B being the very busy airports and their surrounding areas, and then C and D being less busy and other types of airports. So if you're close to an airport, you definitely need to understand what type of airport it is and how the airspace around you is controlled before you put a drone in the air. So a few other prohibitions that fall under Part 107 if you're operating here. So this would be, again, the operation of drones that are more than 0.55 pounds up to 55 pounds. So the pilot in command cannot operate more than one drone at a time. No operations from a moving aircraft or a moving vehicle unless the operation is over a sparsely populated area. Under no circumstances can you be careless or reckless. No carriage of any hazardous material. Most drones, or many drones, have some sort of function to carry an external load, but under no circumstances can you carry a hazardous material. No operations in restricted airspace like we talked about in the last slide. No operations over stadiums or sporting events. Last fall, there was a drone that was flown over Michigan Stadium. Those people I know were taken into custody, but those kinds of operations are taken very seriously and not allowed. You can also not operate near emergency response efforts. such as wildfires. As I mentioned earlier, what happens in these situations is that the aircraft that are fighting those fires are required to land if there's a drone sighting until it can be determined that it's safe to fly again. So as much as people might be curious and think, well, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to stay under a certain I'll keep a safe distance from the helicopter that's flying or airplane, maybe even if there's a police helicopter around, you want to check out what's going on. Just know that you're going to cause interference with those operations, because those aircraft will be allowed to, or will be required to land, and they will try to find you. And there will be some repercussions from that. Likely fines, or potentially being arrested. A few other requirements for operating under Part 107. Operations require pre-flight inspection by the pilot in command, so you need to check out your drone, make sure it's safe to fly. The PIC cannot operate if you know or have reason to know of any mental or physical condition which could interfere with safe flight. Similar to that PIC requirement for pilots of other types of aircraft other than unmanned. External load, as I mentioned, a lot of drones are capable of handling external loads. However, you need to make sure that it's securely attached and it doesn't affect the flight characteristics or controllability of the drone. So if once you attach that external load and the drone becomes wobbly or something like that, then that's not going to be allowed. There are limited ways that you can use drones under Part 107 to collect compensation or for those kinds of activity. This can only happen if the drone weighs less than 55 pounds, including any attached external load or cargo or cameras. So once you combine all those things together, it still has to be under 55 pounds. Flight still has to be conducted within the visual line of sight and not from a moving vehicle or aircraft. And the flight has to occur wholly within the bounds of the state. So you can't start a flight in Michigan and end it in Illinois or something like that. It has to be completely within the bounds of the state. And you can see those other things that apply to Hawaii and territories listed there. Many parts of 107 can be waived. There's a specific formal waiver process with the FAA that that you can apply to have certain parts of those requirements, like perhaps from a moving vehicle or outside the line of sight. But there are certain things that will not be waived under any circumstances. And that's if the drone is over 55 pounds, if the drone is carrying hazardous materials, or if there's no remote pilot and control, if it's all completely autonomous. There are certain requirements for pilots, pilot certification. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but just know that there are testing requirements and certain things that have to take place before you can be considered the remote pilot and control, overseeing drone operations. Again, there are some records requirements that the remote pilot and control has, and you should review those and make sure you understand those before you operate a drone under Part 107. One of the interesting things that is that's being considered and promulgated by the FAA is this idea of remote ID. It's been delayed a couple of times, but we're assured again that it's coming in 2021. Remote ID is basically the concept that your drone is going to be required to transmit the location of the operator, so the remote pilot control, the location of the drone, the velocity of the drone, and other identifying data related to the drone. This is going to be, has to be transmitted in near real time. And the FAA says that this is required to integrate drones into the national airspace. So we talked a little bit about airspace earlier and how it relates to areas around airport and other aircraft. So this is a mechanism where the FAA is starting to integrate so that drones can be detected and people can understand where the operators are as drone operations continue to increase and potentially become more a part of the national airspace. So moving into Michigan specific statutes, I've combined a few statutes and sites together. So there are a couple of statutes that control drone operations in Michigan. And first, the statutes say that a political subdivision, which is a county, city, village, that kind of government entity, cannot regulate drones unless it's specifically permitted to do that by statute, or unless the drone itself belongs to the municipality. So a municipality can make rules about its own drone operations, but unless otherwise provided by statute, it cannot set forth rules about drone operations within its bounds. Commercial drone operation is allowed by Michigan statute, provided that it's also authorized by the FAA. Hobby operation, again, is permissible, but it must be conducted in compliance with federal law. The other thing that the initial Michigan statute did, and I think we have some members with us today, is to establish a task force to help develop these statewide policies and make recommendations on how drones should be operated, used, and regulated within Michigan. So one of the big things that I think is important for the audience today is understanding prohibited drone operations so that you can protect your own facilities. So Michigan statute specifically says that drone operations are prohibited from knowingly and intentionally interfering with the operations of a key facility, correctional facility, or other law enforcement facility. The statute goes on to define key facilities, including this following list: a chemical manufacturing facility, refinery, electric utility facility, water intake structure. You can see all of these things listed here. So drone operations that interfere with these kinds of facilities are specifically precluded by statute. So I think that you should understand if your facility meets one of these requirements, or if there's some way for you to talk with the state and be designated as one of these types of key facilities, so that you can be very mindful of the types of operations and what interference with your operations means with regard to drones. And also so that you can cooperate with the law enforcement in your area in the event that there is drone activity that is contrary to this statute. A few other prohibitions in Michigan statutes. Drones cannot be operated if they interfere with corrections officers, law enforcement, EMS services, or search and rescue. So that's very similar to the FAA restriction that you can't interfere with disaster relief. You cannot use drones to harass an individual. You can't interfere or harass with an individual who is hunting. You cannot use a drone to violate a restraining order. So if you had a restraining, I hope this doesn't apply to this particular audience, but if you had a restraining order against you, you can't use a drone to overcome any distance requirements. You can't capture images in a way that evades reasonable expectations of privacy. So this is one that we should talk about a little bit more. And what is a reasonable expectation of privacy for a facility owner? And we'll talk in a little bit about a Supreme Court case that was Dow Chemical versus the United States, where the EPA was using a drone to conduct inspections. So it's really important to know that if you can view your facility from the outside, from the air, using publicly available technology, you generally don't have an expectation of privacy. And again, we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail later, but I want to plant that seed and get you thinking about it. And there are a couple of other restrictions there, but I don't think that they apply here, so I'm going to move on. The Department of Natural Resources has promulgated its own set of restrictions through an order. This is not a statutory restriction, but the DNR has been given statutory authority to implement certain restrictions. So when I talked about earlier that none of those political subdivisions could implement restrictions, this is one of those cases where they're specifically allowed to. So you can see those restrictions listed there and understand how different departments may be given statutory authority to put restrictions or requirements in place. Can we put up polling question number 3, please? So after describing these activities, think about if you've encountered any of these activities at your facility with regard to drones. Have you had down drones on your property, low-level drone operations, experienced careless or reckless drone operations, or requests from government agencies to use drones at your facilities? So as you're thinking about those questions, Michigan statute does provide that a Michigan department, agency, board, or commission can use drones to surveil or conduct inspections, gather evidence in certain situations, provided that the facility is subject to a permit, license, or order issued by the regulatory agency. And those limited circumstances are when the owner or operator of the facility has given express consent for the use of drone in that particular instance, so for that particular inspection activity. If the agency is acting under a valid search warrant, then they can use the drones. The drone in that particular circumstance is going to be limited to the subject matter and scope of warrant. They can't go looking for other things. The agency can use the drone in these situations where it has reason to believe that there may be an imminent threat to public health, some sort of state of emergency that presents an imminent threat, or the agency is conducting a roadway, highway, airport, or other kind of similar infrastructure inspection. So other than in those limited circumstances, an agency cannot use a drone to conduct these surveillance activities. Any drone used in these situations has to be, it looks like I apologize, it looks like the slides advanced one too many. Drones have to be clearly marked as state-owned in those types of situations. Can we see the answers to that polling question? Wow. This is really interesting. I hadn't expected that so many people would have the low-level drone operations near your facility. So I'm sure privacy concerns are very real for you. That's very interesting. Okay, so these slides about inspection activity are really relevant to this group. So you should understand that the consent of the facility owner or operator can be conditioned on the use of an unmanned aircraft system, a drone that's owned and operated by the facility. So if you do decide to give consent, the agency can either use their own drone or you can require that they use your drone. The agency shall also allow, under its direct supervision, the use of your drones. So they have to be there with you in the collection of that evidence or inspection activity. If doing so will gather information of a quality or nature sufficient for the intended purpose. The facility owner, if you do consent to using a drone for this inspection activity, there's a written statement required. If you decline, you also have to provide a written statement that you have declined to give consent for that type of inspection activity. Note that any data, videos, or images are collected in these inspection activities are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. However, there is a rebuttable presumption included in the statute. So there are some limited situations where that information could become subject and available to the public under a FOIA request. So as your polling results show, there's definitely been an increase in use by regulators of drones, particularly with regard to facility operators. One that you're probably very aware of is the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE. Since 2017, they've flown more than 190 missions. Their stated applications are that they want to use drones for these inspection activities to develop current and accurate base maps used for remediation or site assessments, allowing them to observe areas that are difficult or impossible to otherwise inspect. They're definitely looking to use their drone fleet to conduct site inspections, such as scrap tire piles, open fill areas, landfill covers, and most recently, dam safety inspection. Based on what happened in Midland, I think those activities are probably they're going to look to increase there. You can see the other stated purposes that EGLE specifically is looking to use those drones for. There's also been conversations and information that OSHA is also using drones to inspect work sites. So perhaps being able to get an aerial view that's otherwise unreachable because maybe a ladder broke or something like that, or going into collapsed buildings that are otherwise uninspectable to get better information about understanding what might have happened in an accident situation. Again, consent of the facility owner is required in all of these situations. Recently, the Railroad Commission of Texas has published a release that says that in 2021, it will be their priority to use drones to monitor and enforce oil and gas violations. So using that drone technology to detect those, increasing their inspection activity. They've already exceeded their anticipated inspections for this year. So the use of drones is really allowing regulators to conduct more inspections more frequently. So that's something to keep an eye on. Make sure that you remain aware of what your obligations are with regard to providing or withholding consent and what that might mean to your organization. So with the good that comes from drones and delivering things like vaccines and helping fight wildfires, of course, comes drone-related threats. You've probably heard on the news about some of the disturbing things that are happening in Houston, leading to the close of the Chinese consulate down there. There are definitely malicious schemes by terrorists, criminal organizations, and other lone actors that have specific malicious objectives. With the ability to carry external loads on drones, they can be weaponized or used to smuggle. A lot of prisons in the area have had situations where drones can easily fly over the prison barriers and smuggle things in to prisoners. So that's an increased risk that is definitely happening. And one of the things that a lot of this audience is probably very concerned about is the prohibited surveillance and reconnaissance, whether it be by a regulatory agency or as we move on, industrial espionage and intellectual property theft. So be mindful of the things that can be seen from the air with these drones, the fact that they're carrying cameras, transmitting information back, and think about the types of things that you can do to protect your intellectual property from being viewed from the air. Because there are going to be, we'll talk about here in a second, there are limited things that are available to you through the legal channels at this point, because as I mentioned very early in the presentation, the technology is outpacing the regulatory scheme of both using and prohibited activities related to drones. Drones can be used to disrupt your workplace, interfere with your operations, causing damage to property, potentially damage, personal injury, harassing your workers, making it difficult or dangerous for them to do their job. And recently there's been reports that foreign drone manufacturers are still able to remotely capture data that's being collected by the cameras attached to the drones that they are manufacturing, to make sure that you are doing your research and understanding that you're buying your drones from a reliable source, and how, if they've been involved in any of these activities to try to collect, illegally collect some of your proprietary information. There are some laws and statutes that are in place to try to protect facilities. Drones are prohibited from flying over designated national security sensitive facilities like military bases, Department of Defense facilities, national landmarks, and certain critical infrastructures such as nuclear power plants. There is a portion under the 2018 Act related to drones that allows operators, there's a provision in there that allows operators of fixed site facilities such as critical infrastructure, oil refineries, chemical facilities, railroads, and other things to seek restrictions on unmanned aircraft operations in close proximity to their sites. There's supposed to be a formal application process where you get added to a designated list of fixed site facilities and are allowed this broader protection. This has been delayed. It's been delayed twice. It's currently expected in September of 2020. So keep an eye out for that. And hopefully there will be a process available soon for you to achieve that type of federal designation as a fixed site facility. Note that drones are also subject to FAA's general aviation requirements, which prohibit the careless or reckless operation. I've mentioned this a few times, but I think it's important to understand that it is a prohibition by the FAA's regulations, so that you can understand that it is a reportable activity if you're viewing these kinds of things. If it endangers life or property, then it's definitely a reportable activity according to the FAA regulations. We talked a little bit about the consent that's required for state and regulatory use inspection. Of course, there's those certain limitations such as emergency situations. So keep an eye on what that looks like, in case I could see that changing as drone activity increases, as inspections increase that way. I think that that's an area of law that's ripe to be more fully developed. It's pretty simplistic right now, but make sure you understand the basics that you are not required to give consent. You can do so, and you can do so under certain situations. Let's go ahead and put up polling question number 4 as well. Now that we've talked a little bit about what key facilities are and a little bit about fixed site facilities, this question is just, where do you think that you fall as a key facility under Michigan law? While you think about that question, a few other protections that are in place. As I mentioned, FAA regulations do not generally prohibit flying over or near private property, but do remember that they do prohibit flying over people, flying over stadiums, and those kinds of activities. Again, the reckless and carelessness requirement of FAA regulations. So I mentioned the Dow chemical case from 1986, where courts have upheld the use of aerial photography to perform site inspections. What the court said in this case is that Dow did not have a reasonable expectation of privacy, that the EPA was given the authority to inspect by Congress through statute, and that they were doing so with an aerial camera that was readily available to the public. So they weren't using any sort of special technology or anything like that. And they really likened Dow's facility and its surrounding area to an open field, more than what they call in real property curtilage, which is the immediate area surrounding your home in a personal situation where you have an expectation of privacy. So what they said is that while they do have some expectation of privacy in an open field situation where something is readily viewable from the air, that there was no expectation of privacy and therefore no violation of the Fourth Amendment, and that the EPA was allowed to conduct that inspection by air. The reason why this is important, this case, again, I know it seems old, it's from 1986, but it's been cited nearly 2,000 times and only been treated negatively, I think around 20 times. And that generally that negative treatment has just been distinguishing different sets of facts and things like that. So this is still the current landscape as we understand it, and as the courts have applied the law to it. So absent some sort of specific statutes, like those Michigan statutes and the specific FAA regulations that we've talked a lot about, there's not a general prohibition from using aerial photography, using readily commercially available things. Let's see the answer to the polling question there. Great. So it looks like we have a ton of key facility operators with us today. And I think that understanding that statutory protection is available to you from the state of Michigan statute with regard to drone operations that may interfere with your facilities is very important. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So if we can dismiss the polling question results, please. So there are a lot of counter and anti-drone technologies that are available to purchase. However, many of them are illegal. Some of them are legal, but a lot of them require extensive coordination with the federal and local authorities. So we saw in the polling data that many of you have experienced low flying drones around your facilities. So I recommend that you reach out to your local law enforcement and understand if any of these counter and anti-drone technologies may be available to you and which ones they are. So just a few more high-level things. How can you protect your facility? You really need to understand the airspace and the domain around your facility and who has the authority to take action to enhance security. So go back and take a look at those Michigan statutes when you get these materials afterward, and understand, is it Michigan law that applies or is it an FAA regulation, and who should I call? If you experience reckless or careless operations around your facilities, call your local authorities. See if you can implement legally approved counter drone technology, anti-drone technology, and think about what your response plan and your actions might be, and document them in your emergency response plan, including any suspicious activity reporting. So not necessarily just the careless or reckless, but if you think that you might be the subject of espionage or someone trying to steal your intellectual property, then report that activity. Particularly in Michigan, I know that there are a lot of agencies that keep an eye on this and are very interested in this activity. A few implications with giving consent for the regulatory inspections. There's definitely an increased risk to your facility or your employees just by the virtue that you're operating a drone, potentially within the bounds of your facility or even without. So when you introduce drone operations, there's always a risk that there might be damage to people or property in your facility. There's the possibility that trade secrets could be captured in that inspection and there would be no protection for them. Again, while there's a statement that it's not subject to FOIA, any information collected through these inspections by the Michigan agencies, there's a rebuttable presumption in that statutory provision. So there are circumstances where that could come to light. Typically, when you're employing a drone in these inspections, there are increased boundaries of the inspection. Other things may not be available through a more routine inspection that are now going to be opened up by drone inspections. You may have the inability to accompany inspectors in this regard just because of the nature of the drone operations. So think about how your inspections have been conducted in the past and how you have accompanied inspectors on your property to conduct them. And there is the possibility that other violations could be detected and potentially shared with another agency after the inspection is over. There's no prohibition on that kind of activity. So lastly, what should you do if you report any of these things that we've talked about? If it's an FAA regulatory issue, there are two flight standards district offices that are in Michigan. If you're outside of Michigan, these FSDOs can be found on the website. Their phone numbers and an online reporting mechanism are available there. If you have relationships with the FBI or Homeland Security, reach out to them and let them know that you're experiencing these things. They are more than willing to help you develop reporting channels and being aware of the kinds of things that you should be looking for and the kinds of things they want you to report. Michigan State Police has an online reporting form that you can access and provide information. Make sure you understand who and what did you see, when and where did you see it, and what makes it suspicious so that you can provide complete reports. And then both the Department of Homeland Security and Michigan State Police urge the use of 911 if there's a Homeland Security situation, criminal activity, or some other immediate threat that requires immediate attention. So with that, I think that we can take a look at questions.
All right, thank you very much. That was a lot of very helpful, valuable information. I think the questions will hopefully also address some specific interests or areas of concern to participants. So please share those in the chat or the Q&A. One of the first questions we have is just about the registrations and whether those are publicly available, all these 1.5 or more million drones. Is there a database somewhere that this can be looked up? Let's say you find one on your property. Can you go and check who that is?
Yes. So as I mentioned, once you register your drone, it's going to be assigned an FAA registration number. It's the same kind of registration that gets applied to aircraft. So if you've been at the airport and you see on the tail of the aircraft a number that starts with N and then has 4 or 5 numbers after it, that's the registration number, and you can go to the FAA registry, the registration branch, and you can look up, you can type in that number and it will tell you who owns that particular drone or aircraft.
Is it fair to say that visually speaking, it'd be difficult, if not impossible, to view that number and get it in any meaningful way from a drone that's in the air?
I think that that's probably right, unfortunately. And I think that's where this remote ID law is why that's being pushed, so that real-time information about where the drone operator is and where the drone is being relayed in real time.
Okay. Question also about why can't you just shoot down a drone over your property? You know, and that's, I think, gets to this question of whose airspace is it, which has broader issues, but that's not allowed. I mean, why? And what's the on the counter drone thing too? Why would the FAA look unkindly on jamming a drone and downing it over your airspace if it's 100 feet above your chemical plant?
Well, I think that the concern there is that there's a technology that, while it may jam the drone that you're specifically looking at, it could also jam other activities that are nearby. So that's why it needs to be coordinated, and why some of them are not allowed, because of the unintended consequences of using that. Likewise, shooting down a drone, I think that states vary on that. And again, it gets into the whose property is it. You can't own airspace. You do not own the air above your facility. So technically, there may not be a trespass. So you could be damaging someone else's property where they maybe haven't violated something yet.
Right. And I think most people that are looking at this issue as a novice or not an attorney or some experience in aviation law think that, okay, I understand a Boeing 737 flying over my plant, they're doing their thing. That's not the same as a drone that may be hovering 100 feet above my plant. But in terms of the legal landscape, it is still airspace in the same sense. And so you have to look to other specific, regulations, as we've kind of talked about today, as far as what happens beneath that 400 feet, which is where the drones are operating.
Correct. I think it goes to what is your expectation of privacy, and is there any interference? If there's reckless or careless operation, if you suspect something nefarious like industrial espionage or something like that, then you need to report those. And because once you start capturing that data, then you're not just viewing something from the air anymore. It's taking it one step farther. So, I would err on the side of reporting and developing closer. If you have experienced this low flying activity, I would reach out to your law enforcement, or if you have, particularly if you're part of the defense industrial base, which has the DSS office in Livonia, work with them to understand what your options are and how they can help you, because they're just as interested in that activity as you are. So reach out to your local law enforcement, understand when and how they want to hear from you, and develop those relationships before the activity happens.
Right, and I think that's one of the good points, the takeaways, is that while aviation, including drone operation, is regulated by the FAA. When it comes to security issues and the other concerns you may have, that then falls, yes, to FAA, but you will be encouraged to, as you mentioned, whatever your regulator may be, if you're in the energy industry, your regulators at the state level there or the federal level, DHS. I know my experience in conversations with people at Michigan State Police, critical infrastructure desk, or chemical facility anti-terrorism standards, DHS CFATS. Those inspectors and people are very security minded and are very interested in understanding what these issues are. And so they encourage you to be very forthright in sharing that and doing the reporting so that they have an understanding and can build that record of information and potentially do follow-up. I know there's other question here about has there been cases where video or photo evidence from drones had been admitted or excluded by a judge, and when would a judge consider using that?
That's a pretty broad question, I think, and it's not one that I'm prepared to answer today. That would take some research and quite a bit of digging. I think it's fair to say that it would be admissible in some circumstances. I think it depends on if you're talking about a criminal case versus a civil case and what kinds of circumstances there are. There may be very good reasons in a civil case where you want to view the top of a roof that's at issue to present evidence and things like that, which I think would be allowed by the court. But I think that that's really a fact-specific and fact-driven question that would take some research to really identify the answer.
Okay. One just general question about drones, how big they are, what kind of equipment or sensors they use. I mean, what kind of information really would they be able to gather that would be valuable about, for better or worse, about a facility?
I think the simplest thing is that they can, any type of technology can be attached to a drone, whether it's a thermal sensor, whether it's all kinds of sensors, whatever you can attach to them that can either collect and store information on board the aircraft, or if it's something that's going to collect and transmit it back somewhere. And then, of course, you have the very obvious video and sound that can transmit in real time back to the control station, which can also be recorded and captured, whether it's images or video. So I think, they can detect emissions and they can record all kinds of temperature or all kinds of different things. So anything that can be attached, it could either store it locally or transmit it back. So I think, honestly, pun intended, sky's the limit.
Yeah, fugitive emissions, leaks from tanks or vessels or process, even potentially I can envision where you could do sort of stack testing almost, or ambient air testing around facility, fence line monitoring using a drone. And the concern would be maybe not only the regulator doing that, but also a third-party NGO could get that kind of information and all of a sudden use it for their own purposes.
Right. And even, groundwater testing and those sorts of things are conducted using a drone too.
Okay. I don't know if it's possible just to go back to that definition of key facility that was a number of slides back in Michigan, and had a question on just how that's defined and whether that, would need to be updated in any sense. This deals with physical trespass, but it's been shoehorned into now the reference for drones. So if your facility falls under there, you don't need to apply anywhere to the state of Michigan, but you do need to post signage, I believe, according to that statute. And it's well worth your time to investigate that and make sure you're, following the requirements essentially to be eligible and to be considered that, because it then affords you greater protection under the law.
Right. I know that there's a question about whether or not it needs to be updated. And I think that it depends on your facility. If you're not seeing it there and you think you should be, then I think that's definitely something you should reach out to your industry representatives and to your legislators about and trying to get added. And notice that the very last bullet point there is kind of a catch-all. It's a limited catch-all to try to capture facilities that might be similar to those above. So see if maybe that designation fits you within that definition.
Okay. Are there any other questions from attendees? What to know about these technologies? They're changing rapidly. As you mentioned, some of the federal regulations that are currently in process, that is kind of the prerequisite for some of this, to have remote ID of what the drones are doing, and then later on, hopefully, to have some of these protections. One other thing I guess I would ask you about is, can you explain what geofencing is as it regards drones, and what do you know about whether the drone companies themselves will be able to create some protections for facilities by the software itself, and prevent the hobbyists from getting close to?
Sure. So geofencing, I think what you're asking is geofencing in relation to sort of an anti-drone technology. What geofencing is being able to either, with regard to the actual drone being operated, put parameters around where it can, based on geographic coordinates, where it can be operated, or likewise employing anti-drone technology that would prohibit operations within a certain space. And I think that where that, the ability to use it is it depends answer. And again, you don't own the airspace. Airspace under 400 feet is not controlled. Over 400 feet is controlled by the FAA, but you don't own it and therefore can't control it. So I think it's going, I think that's probably not an allowable use at this point, but I don't know that, I don't know the exact specific details of that, but you should be mindful of the fact that you don't own airspace above your facility and you don't have the right to control it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the technology changes, and we'll see, I'm sure, the race to create bigger and better and faster drones, and then also address some of these concerns, and of course, legally, then what you're able to do overlays all of it. So with that, we'll conclude. We're a few minutes past, but I thank you for your time, Mary, in presenting, of course. And if there's questions, you just want to bring up your contact information again at the end. We will be sending out the slides following this, and make sure that you have this information and be able to follow up with Mary and her colleagues in aviation, or one of their colleagues that deals with environmental issues, or other corporate matters that may intersect. So thank you again, and we appreciate everybody's time. We look forward to future webinars on different topics through our webinar series. We have another one coming up in 2 weeks from now, and look for emails on that. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.